coming to you direct from the nerve center of the galaxy's greatest comic. This is the 2000 AD Thrillcast.
Borag Thung, athletes, and welcome to the latest episode of the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. I am your host, Mulchar. Now, on this episode, we are celebrating 30 years of the magazine, and there's no better time to do this. Not only is the 30th anniversary Meg out this month, it has also sold out, and it's sold out in under 24 hours, which is absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everyone who has supported the magazine in its 30th birthday year. We've detailed some of the amazing things in this issue already, but it's wonderful to see people responding really well to the magazine, which has been on a high for quite a while now. So in this episode, we're really going to reach back, celebrate 3 decades of not just 2000 AD spin-off, its sister comic, the moon that orbits around the planet 2000 AD. And we're joined by, the gang that helped make it happen. We have a full complement of Judge Dredd Megazine editors. That's Steve MacManus, David Bishop, John Tomlinson, Andy Diggle, Alan Barnes, and Matt Smith on a single Zoom call, and it's wonderful to be able to chat to them about their time at the helm, whether it was short, whether it was long, what makes the magazine special, talking about the reprints that have been in the magazine over the years, the influence of John Wagner and Alan Grant, not just on those early issues where they were putting the whole thing together. So, going to be chatting away to them in a second. And then we have something else from the archive, which is from our very first episode. And this was an interview with Colin McNeil, the artist on America, which was one of the first lineup stories from the magazine. And wonderful to hear that again. His views on America as a strip, his own experience working on it, and something that a strip that has had a real profound effect, not just on the magazine, not just on Dred as a character, but on perceptions of Judge Dredd in the wider world. Don't forget that there are 2 publications out this month that focus on America. There is the Essential Judge Dredd America, which is a collection that takes America and places it into its context. So it's no longer having it just as a standalone story. It's basically the democracy arc. So it's led from a Democrat, it's Revolution, it's Twilight's Last Gleaming, etc., etc. That includes recoloured artwork by John Higgins. So that is a perfect collection to appreciate America in its context, but also to encourage people to read Judge Dredd for the first time. The whole point of the Essentials line is so people can pick it up and go, well, right, this is Dredd. These are the key things that they need to read, rather than having to plough through the case files necessarily. There's also America Lost and Found, which is where the original script for America is published alongside the strip with annotations by John Wagner. Very special collection. Really great to hear his insights, short and long, into his thoughts on the strip. So definitely pick those up. Have a listen to the interview with Colin McNeil at the end of this episode. Thank you so much for the lovely feedback we've been getting. Quite a few people getting in touch to say how much they enjoy the lockdown tapes. These are going to continue, and by the sounds of it, for a while longer. But we've got plenty more interviews coming up in future episodes. If you want to get in touch, thrillcast at 2000ad.com. Thrillcast, all one word, at 2000ad.com. So, I managed to get all the people who have worked on the magazine editorially onto one Zoom call, which was absolutely fantastic. And it wasn't just an opportunity to celebrate the magazine, but also to focus on the highs and the lows of the past 30 years. it is absolutely wonderful to be able to welcome the full range of editor droids from the Judge Dredd magazine throughout its 30-year history. So there's Steve MacManus, David Bishop, Andy Diggle, Alan Barnes, John Tomlinson, and Matt Smith. Welcome all to this chat. I guess the most obvious place to start is at the beginning. So really, this is for Steve and David. Now, David, you wrote a fascinating blog post about the beginnings of the magazine. I was wondering if you or Steve could start us off sort of talking about the genesis of the magazine and how it came to be.
Steve for that. I was a Johnny come lately. I turned up just before launch.
The genesis. Well, as you know, we tried in 1984 with a fortnightly dummy, but the business plan produced a cover price of 45p, which IPC kind of balked at. I don't know why, because at the time readers were paying 3p more every fortnight from 2000 AD. Maybe it was because they weren't comfortable with the idea of a fortnightly. Actually, if you think about it, why didn't we just go ahead and do a Judge Dredd weekly? But that notion of a Dredd comic remained in the air, even though it never got to see print in 1984.
I find that fascinating because obviously IPC and particularly John Sanders were big fans of the old Hatch, Match and Dispatch way of doing things, and we'd seen Star-Lord, we'd seen Tornado. There've been various fold-ins to 2000 AD. Steve, do you think the relative failure of titles such as Star-Lord and Tornado, do you think that scared IPC a little bit, that they were worried about touching what were relatively steady sales on 2000 AD?
I'm sure it did, yeah. And of course, so they would have been afraid that a Judge Dredd title would have cannibalized, that awful marketing term, the sales of 2000. So they decided, I guess, to play it safe until the film became more of a reality.
So in terms of the beginning of the Judge Dredd magazine, Steve, how certain were you that it would succeed, and what were the elements that you feel were there at the beginning that made it a success?
I think it has to be when the Dredd film was green lit, or whatever the expression is. That kind of gave the notion of the Dredd magazine a lot of oomph. I remember standing in the office of John Davidge, managing director at the time, and listening to him talking to Edward R. Pressman on the telephone about the film's progress. Apparently, Arnie Schwarzenegger had just called Pressman and said, "There's only one man in Hollywood who can play this part, and that's me." So when you hear Hollywood actors fighting over the lead role, you know that there's going to be some good PR for a title based on Dred.
So these early days, you had John Wagner and Alan Grant on as commissioning editors, and that was a very I guess bold thing to do at that point in time, because this was the age of Deadline and Crisis and Revolver, and soon, not long after the magazine launch, Toxic. Steve, could you tell us a little bit about why that was decided to be the thing that you wanted to do, rather than have somebody in house creating the magazine? What were the reasons for having John and Alan do it?
Oh God, it would be unthinkable not to have had John and Alan involved in the creation of a title that was going to expand the world. They had been creating as best they could within 6 pages every week for a good 12 years. It would have been unthinkable. Deadline and Crisis, I think, were different propositions. The magazine spoke to the 2000 AD readership and presented them with bags more of their favorite character. Obviously, Crisis aimed itself at the same readership, but its editorial proposal was that the readers would be keen to accept strips of a more challenging nature, which didn't bode so well for success. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, it does. I find it so interesting that this was the moment when this experiment was chosen as something to move forward with. I mean, just coming back to that question about what were the elements that you think were there at the beginning that made sure the magazine survived, where those titles we've just mentioned didn't?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I guess the notion of a title devoted to Dred's world had always been electrifying. And the main element that augured well for its success was the opportunity for John and Alan to develop that world, to create, if you like, a character universe similar to DC or Marvel. And when you think of it in that way, it seemed like a slam dunk. How could it fail? I mean, if it had failed, I think we could have all gone home at that point.
David, I want to ask you about your involvement, because as you say, you kind of came as the magazine was due to launch. You came in as assistant editor. Can you tell us a bit about your memories of that time, stepping into the office and being involved in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Just jumping back to the previous question, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that the likes of Action and Battle and 2000 AD had all been formed by having freelance editorial working alongside an in-house editor. So there was a tradition of that had worked previously. So actually, in those terms, something like Crisis and Revolver were the exception up to that point in the history of how they developed. But I remember I came in, I'd immigrated over from New Zealand at the start of 1990, and then I saw a job advertised, which was the assistant editor on Revolver, and I went in for an interview with Steve and Pete Hogan, and didn't get the job. But afterwards, Steve took me aside and said, "Oh, we're going to be launching this Judge Dredd title later in the year, so stay in touch, and come the summer, you can." If you want, you can come in and assist me on that. So I kept my ear to the ground and kept working away, and then started in, I think it was towards the last week of July 1990. And at that point, most of the opening run of stories was already in hand. Most of America was in hand. So I just remember my first week on the job, I just sat there and opened the plans chest, because it was all physical artwork in those days. And these incredible, huge painted spreads by Colin McNeil of America, this gorgeous artwork, and just sort of looking at it. And most of it had been lettered as well. So it was just ready to roll. And then other strips were coming in. Midnight's Children was a very late edition, was dropped in instead of something else. And then we had Pete Doherty. It was only his second job, and he was doing Young Death. And every page that came in was better than the page before. It's that thing with new artists. You give them their head, and you can just watch them blossom. So it's, sort of the opening, the first 3 issues of the run was pretty locked in. And then after that, sort of John and Alan, by the time I arrived, were basically hands off, and it was up to Steve to take it on from there. And then he turned around to me and said, "Well, go find us some new strips." So my job was to wade through the submissions pile and start trying to find new writers and new artists that could help the magazine along. Because we were very much aware of the fact that John and Alan couldn't write the whole thing, not every month as it was then, on top of what they were doing for 2000. They were also working on Toxica. It didn't last very long for John and Alan as well. So we needed to find other writers. And we didn't want to sort of be burglaring the pages of 2000 AD and leaving 2000 AD with no creators. So we had to try and find other people who could write stories in the Dredd universe that would still pass muster, particularly with John. John could be quite a harsh taskmaster if something doesn't meet his approval.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. Is, John has spoken about how exacting he was with the kind of things that people were proposing, the people that you were looking to work with. And you look at the mix of strips in that first issue, where you do have things that get dropped in at the last minute. So Midnight's Children with Alan and Jim, but the vast majority of it is written by John. You've got also Garth Ennis working on Chopper, Earth, Wind and Fire. Do you think that Wagner's major presence like that, do you think that helped or hindered the magazine?
Oh, absolutely helped. I mean, when it comes to Dred, Wagner is still like the font from which it all flows outwards, and there's some incredible people writing Dred now in the Page of 2000. Rob's epic that he's just finished as a good example of that. So people are, I think, for a long time after John stopped writing Dred, it's always been the struggle to try and find somebody who could build their own version of Dred and make it stand up. But at that point, nobody else had written Dred really for at least a decade, aside from John and Alan. So it was trying to find a way forward, and so it seemed entirely logical they should start it off, and then it was trying to find other people who could find a way to illuminate other corners of Dred's universe, so it wasn't just Dred, and more Dred all the time.
This is a question for both you and Steve. What was your working relationship like with John and Alan? As you say, there was precedent for that, external freelance editing on strips, but I'm curious as to how that process worked, whether John's exactedness was a barrier, or whether it was a continual process of pushing everybody to think more about the quality of the thing.
I mean, by the time I arrived at the end of July, I think John had pretty much we had the launch run, and he took a back step from that. He certainly wasn't expecting to see scripts written by other writers, and he was like, he didn't want to be an editor. He'd stopped being an editor 10, 15 years earlier, so he'd no real interest in editing other people. I don't think he enjoys that as a situation. So by the time I arrived, it was like, on you go. It was Steve, and then me as Steve's assistant to then find the change strips who could be brought off the subs bench. So it was a case of looking at what had been considered. So there was a rejected John Smith strip. There was a James Hudnall series that never quite got to be. And then it was like looking around to see who were the new arriving writers who might step into the shoes or take some of the pressure off John and Alan to produce everything in the magazine.
Steve, what was your relationship like with John and Alan during this process?
Mainly over the phone, as David says. Once the first issue had come out, and the second issue, and it looked good and the sales were good, so it kind of reverted to a normal editor-writer relationship where you talk on the phone, they send in the script, and that goes off to the artist. Coming back to the point about John ending up writing, thank God he did, all the first issue. I think, as I recall, we put the word out, that Dred World was open, come play in this great universe to all the writers. And to be fair, they came up with good ideas, but when they tried to put that into a script, that's when their inexperience showed, and there wasn't time with deadlines to kind of shepherd them through that. So John manfully decided to write the whole thing himself with Alan's help on Midnight's Children. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to also ask about financial incentives for creators were and remain a very controversial subject. But I believe you argued at the time that it was the only way to really attract talent, particularly John and Alan, onto a project like this. Could you talk us through your ideas on this and the reception you received from the higher-ups who had, in the past, always been very wary of creators' rights?
Yeah, that's quite a long answer. Actually, I realized this morning when I was kind of thinking about it. To take the higher ups first, John Sanders allowed me to issue a kind of working man's contract on Crisis, and then John Davidge made it more of a proper contract, which he issued to all the creators on the 2000 AD stable. But quite simply, I think it was Pat who rang me up and said, if you don't get royalties going or some kind of way for us to get at the back end, we're all going to go to America. So that was quite a good stick to jab the higher ups with. But it was a long, tricky process. And I think the big mistake I made was to focus on royalties on sales, which doesn't really work in the UK. And if we just come straight to the point and said, if there's a movie, you'll get 25% each, or if there's an audio, visual, radio program or TV, everything would have been a lot smoother.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that first issue, because I mean, you know, you had Chopper, you had Young Death, you had strong strips, but America is, I mean, you know, you can argue about whether it's the greatest Judge Dredd strip ever until the cows come home, but it's certainly one of the most profoundly important. What was it like? What was the process like for this? Was it something that John just delivered? Boom, there it is. This is what we're doing, or was there an intention to produce something of that impact?
Not on my part. I think John just did the scripts, and slowly when we realised there was something above and beyond here, especially when Colin's art began to come in full colour. I think also because the scripts were coming in not every week, maybe every 3 weeks, it was almost like being a reader, wondering what happened next. But I don't remember. I just remember thinking this is a great story, but not one that would perhaps go down in the annals of Dreaddom as one of the high points.
Yeah, David.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that America stands so well and stands for so long, casts such a long shadow, but one of the things that's noticeable about the story is a lot of John's stories, he starts the story, but he doesn't necessarily know what the ending is. And it's very noticeable. You look at America and you look at the first series of Button Man, and there's a level of foreshadowing and the way the story is told. He obviously knows how the story is going to end when he starts writing it, because you can't write America any other way. When you look at the first page, when you see America sort of putting on the makeup, and John knows what this means, what the significance of this is. And I remember, because we had the first, however, 4, 5, 6 episodes in the drawer, and most of them have been lettered. We had the scripts to go with the artwork. The only script we didn't have was the final script of America. And I remember when it came in, and I opened it and I read it and went, oh, because I didn't know who America was, who was inside the body of America, and what had happened, and what Bennett Beanie had done as a consequence. So I didn't know that. I was just like every other reader. I had no involvement in the creative process. So I just read it going, oh my God, what? But I think the fact that John sat down and plotted it out to some extent is unusual for John. And so I think that's that sort of thinking through the totality of the story and its significance, and also its overarching, the fact that it's not, Dred is always told in real time, 122 years in the future, and America doesn't do that. That's why it stands apart, and that's why I think it stands, why it's so significant, because it's a different writing approach in the first place. And then, of course, Colin's amazing art. Although we did a slight nightmare in that he started varnishing the pages for reasons I never quite understood. And it was huge physical artwork, which then had to be stripped off the Bristol boards or whatever board, Dala board, I think he was painting on at the time. And it would be stripped off and wrapped around the drum so they could take the photos of it in order to make the artwork. And kept cracking, the varnish kept cracking. They had to do all these repairs to the art. Oh, it was a nightmare. They had to persuade Colin to put the varnish down.
I did see John just there nodding away when you mentioned the varnish?
Well, I don't remember the trademark O'Neill varnish specifically, but I know a lot of artists did use stuff like that, and also to apply artwork on very thick boards that then had to be stripped in order to wrap around the scanning drum. And it was a slightly nightmarish way to work, which I'd actually forgotten about until David mentioned that. So that's why I was laughing. Oh, thank God we don't do that anymore. But yeah, it was worth it in the end, certainly with a strip like America.
I heard thousands of art enthusiasts scream in horror at the idea of treating artwork like that. Oh, thank God we don't have to do that anymore. I want to move on a little bit, and this is a question really for any of you, because Steve mentioned about perhaps IPC was scared that Dred being the most popular character in 2000 AD, a separate title for him would cannibalize sales, would strip away the readership from 2000 AD who only really wanted to read Dred. And I just wondered if any of you had that same fear, and whether that has been a presence in the history of the magazine, not necessarily wanting to overshadow the prog, or even vice versa, whether the prog completely overshadows the meg. Actually, John, you know what? Could I mean, when we talked on email, you said you were a caretaker editor. You weren't in the meg chair for very long, but you had been editor at 2008.
6 issues. Yeah.
Say again?
Sorry, 6 issues. Yeah, of the magazine. Yeah, so not very long, really.
What's your take on that? What was the relationship like for you between the prog and the meg when you were editor?
Well, the time in which you had to put an issue together was considerably more relaxed on the magazine. I think, excuse me, largely because David had got so far ahead, and there were drawers full of artwork that really just had to be edited against the script, sent out to lettering, and then sent off for the infamous repro process. So on 2000 AD, which was a weekly, it was a much more hand-to-mouth process, and quite white knuckle ride often. And you have artists, otherwise brilliant artists, who would lose confidence in a story after drawing one episode and disappear for weeks on end. And often you could contact them, but more often than not, you couldn't. So then you had to find a fill-in artist, and you can't get all J. Jonah Jameson about it. You have to be sort of understanding of the pressure that they're all under. And so no, I was trying to be understanding. But yes, I mean, on 2000 AD, for example, there was one strip which I won't mention for fear of embarrassing the writer, but he was he was a very thorough and very imaginative writer, and also very sort of, I won't say verbose, but his panel descriptions were incredibly detailed. I think only Al Moore's Watchmen comes above the amount of detail this guy would put in. And he kind of fallen behind his script deadline. So towards the end of the series, he was faxing in the script. This is in the era of faxes, 1 page at a time, which I then had to fax to the artist and the colorist. And it was always kind of touch and go whether you get the issue out at all. And we always did. I mean, sometimes ended up working pretty late to do it, but we always got it to press, and very rarely more than a day or so late. But the magazine was an absolute breeze by comparison. I take no credit for that. It was entirely down to David and the amount of stuff he'd commissioned ahead of time. If that answers your question.
Actually, Alan.
Well, conversely, when I came into it, which was late 2001, I found I had basically nothing. I had 2 installments of War Dog, which was the Rebellion tie-in game. I had 1 single Dred strip from John Wagner, and I had the first part of a Missionary Man script. No art done, nothing. I had 6 weeks to go before the first issue was supposed to go to press. I had a bit longer than that. And that was literally it. So yeah, my experience was slightly different in that I cheerfully cannibalised anyone who was working for 2000 at the time, and probably messed up match schedules terribly. It just, I was just leaping for whatever was there, really.
I guess the Meg is a challenge of a different type to 2008. 2000 AD eats material very, very quickly, burns through an awful lot, whereas the Meg is a bit more relaxed in its schedule, and there's only 12 issues or so a year, but there's more of it. The episodes are longer. Was there John mentioned there about creators losing enthusiasm, shall we say, part way in. Were there any occasions when a creator who was used to maybe working on 2080 was like, oh god, this is actually a lot to get through, if you see what I mean?
No, because what I was more worried about was, as a punter, being aware that I didn't want to have too many stories going on for like months and months on end. I felt that the 3 issues was the maximum length for a story, really, 3 or 4, because otherwise you've kind of lost track. So I quickly sort of settled on sort of 3x8s, or sort of around about that as being the sort of ideal, the average sort of story. So once you've got sort of 3x8 in your head, which builds to one sort of 24-page story, it is actually quite easy to find an artist who can turn that around on a 4-weekly schedule. Because what you're actually asking them to do is 8 pages every 4 weeks, 2 pages a week, basically. So you can actually commission them quite late, relatively late in the day, far later than you can on 2000, which, for example, would have a 10-part serial with 6 pages each. And you've got to backtrack from there. I mean, poor old Matt has always had this immense length of time to actually factor in. So he's actually just going to get the last page of the last serial in, even just in time for the last print. You're talking about sort of 6 months in advance. To get even a fast artist doing it. Whereas I was really free. I worked out quite quickly that I could grab hold of whoever had a little gap and say, can you come and do 2 pages a week for me? And usually often they could. But that was just the point in the Meg's history that I was at, which wasn't true of anyone. And and actually I quickly worked out that also the fact that there was no inventory at the time, although it was terrifying the first couple of weeks, because I'd literally never, I'd come from completely outside the organisation. I hadn't met any of these people or anything, but it was immensely freeing because I didn't have to work through 17 years of something commissioned by David. Not that it would have been great.
You're welcome.
Andy, I want to come to you because we've not heard from you yet. What was your experience of working on the Meg? Because it was relatively brief, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. I mean, I'd come into 2000 AD, I think sort of 97 or 98 as David's assistant. But as he gradually came to trust me a little bit to play with his toys, I took over the editing of the magazine as well. But by this point, it was published by Egmont, who never quite got 2000 AD and the magazine in the way that IPC did. And the budget had been gradually reduced over time. So there was a need for more reprints, basically, because they simply didn't have the budget to fill it with new content, unfortunately. I had been kind of doing the same with Sonic the Comic, and by that point it was largely reprint, but the creators who were working on the new strips for that, they knew what they were doing in a way that I didn't in terms of those characters. So I was happy, they understood the readers and what they wanted, so I was happy to let them do their thing. So as far as the reprint was concerned, I was kind of rummaging around in the archives where there's these huge metal shelving units stacked up with the brown paper envelopes full of old acetates, which had the original copies of the art on which we used. But most of the classic Dred stuff had either been reprinted multiple times and the fans had already bought it multiple times, or it was simply missing. It had been sent off for reprint to some other company and never returned. So it was hard to try and find stuff that would kind of hit the spot for Dred fans, but that wasn't over familiar. Now the weird thing was, I remember as a kid, I'd never read the very early 2000 ADs. I started around Prog 210, right, so early 80s. But a friend of mine who was a big fan from the day one had told me about a Strontium Dog strip called Journey into Hell, and had given me detailed descriptions of Carlos Ezquerra's amazing artwork of these incredible landscapes and these weird characters and so on. And it was always a very vivid thing in my mind. And I'm a huge Strontium Dog fan, and I'd never actually read that. It had never been reprinted as far as I knew. Nobody knew where the films were. And while I was rummaging around in the archives, I literally found the films for Journey into Hell down the back of a filing cabinet. A whole pile of acetates had just slid off the top of a stack and down the back. And I was rifling through it and like, what is this? And there's a guy with a crescent moon for a head, and I was like, bing, big light bulb. So as soon as I got a chance to actually to put it into the Meg, I figured, okay, it's not Dred, but it's a classic that's not been seen very often. So that felt like and it was John and Alan and Carlos, so that felt like it was an appropriate thing to put in there. In terms of commissioning the original stuff, one of the big things for the magazine had always been, it's about expanding Dred's world. So it's kind of, it's not just Mega City 1. We also get the Cursed Earth, and we get, African judges and Japanese judges and British judges and so on. But it was all very judgy. It was highly judgmental. And I thought, well, Dred himself, we always want Dred himself, but I thought it might be fun to take Dred off the planet for a change. But I also wanted I love the old classic sort of epics like Judge Child Quest and stuff like that. So I basically said to John, like, how about you cook up something slightly cosmic and slightly crazy in the vein of the Judge Child Quest? And that was basically all the editorial input I gave him, and he sort of took that and ran with it with Dead Ringer. And it was a chance to get to work with Duncan Fegredo, who I've been a huge fan of since I was like 20. And Jock, who had been sending stuff into the submissions pile. One of my first jobs working for David was to kind of rummage through the 2-foot-high submissions pile. And Jock's stuff, like he just sent in unsolicited a huge full-color oil painting of Dred, which just kind of was wow. It's the famous one where he's got the lawgiver the size of a cereal packet, And I just really, I think by that point we'd given him a couple of future shocks or something like that. But it really felt like we need to get this guy in Dred, So yeah, and I think guys like Ben Oliver, who I thought was terrific, who had done a couple of things for Comex by that point, and Wayne Reynolds, who I always thought was kind of underrated on the Dred books, but then went on to huge success afterwards, doing concept art for Pathfinder and stuff like that. So yeah, but it was I kind of, and also I wanted a bit. There was a bit of judges with everything. Like I thought, I always kind of enjoyed Armitage, and I just thought it made a nice change to from uniform judges in Mega City 1. I kind of I just had a soft spot for the character, and for me it kind of felt like a throwback to what old magazine, the original stuff. But it didn't stick around for long. But it was nice to see the character again.
Well, you raised a couple of interesting things that I do want to touch on. The first is new talent, because as Alan said, he wasn't afraid to effectively grab whoever he could from 2000 AD to work on strip. But David, in particular, you brought in a lot of new people during your tenure on the magazine. I was talking the other day for a podcast episode to Steve Sampson, who of course did Brit Babes for the Meg. Was that a policy of born of necessity, that you couldn't necessarily just grab people from 2000 AD, or was it a positive thing, a thing that you wanted to do to bring new voices into in-house?
Both of those, and also it was a necessity of the budget, because new talent is slightly cheaper than great classic talent, and if you're going to have Carlos or Arthur Ranson doing a strip, you're going to have to find a way to balance the books, because the average price that you can spend on art, if you're going to go at the top end, you need to bring in some people who get paid slightly less, unfortunately, because they're not, they haven't been working for 15 years. But no, one of the first things Steve said to me was, once we got the first issue out the door, was like, okay, now you need to go through the slush pile, go through the submissions pile. We need to find, the next Wagner and Grant. We need to find the next artists who can progress the title and take it forward. And so it was finding people who could do that. So people like, Dean Ormston, Pete Doherty was already around. He'd done a one-off in Crisis, so he did Young Death. And then bringing on people after that, so Steve Sampson, managed to get Frank Quitely working on the magazine, which was great because it suddenly everybody stopped sending painted artwork, which was a blessed relief after 5 years of mud. And then just adding to that, and also trying to find writers who could, bring something original to the world of Dred that had something else to say. So somebody like Robbie Morrison, who's probably sort of one of the best examples of the writers to emerge out of those first 5 years of the magazine, and then go on and do Nikolai Dante with Simon Fraser being another example of an artist who had done other things but sort of got a big break through the pages of the magazine. So it was absolutely one of the big jobs was find that next generation of talent, because 2000 had this amazing talent for the first 5 years, and then a lot of them went off to America. And then it had the second wave, the sort of Pete Milligan, Grant Morrison, and John Smith and people like that in terms of scripts, and then artists coming through. But then you have to keep, every 5 years, you have to keep replenishing the talent pool because those people will go. And the problem we had in the 90s was not so much them going to American comics as them going to computer games was the big sort of talent drain of where everybody was heading off to go and do concept art. So that's where you lose people like Jock or Dermot Power, or they go into storyboarding or film and TV design, or they go off and do game design. And we just lost so many great artists because, they're sort of like, they got mortgages and children and had to feed them somehow, and couldn't produce story pages fast enough for the rates that we could pay them, and there weren't any royalties to speak of. So that was our problem. So it was always that quest for new talent, and you want to revive the offering to the readers as well. You want to give them the classics and the great writers and artists, but it's a vehicle. The joy of the anthology is it's a vehicle to give new talent a chance. I remember Steve telling me when I first started, most new creators need at least 100 pages published before they get good, but unfortunately you have to publish those 100 pages. So sometimes you do have to get through a little bit of whichever the wheat chaff, the one that's bad, to get to the good one. I never know which is good, wheat or chaff. Wheat's good?
Wheat is good.
Wait, I'm wondering, Matt, is this something that continues to this day? Is the magazine somewhere that you look to debut new talent, or is it more that you're looking for consistency, I guess?
It's not so much of a problem as it was in the early to mid 90s, because the avenues for our writers and artists have narrowed so much in the last 10, 15 years. There aren't the comics out there for them to work on, and so I tend to find more the problem is I'm finding I don't have the space for people to publish them. So it would be nice to have be us publishing half a dozen titles every month. I could find work for everybody, but because the field has narrowed so much, or the number of titles has narrowed so much that there just isn't the work there for everyone. So I don't really find that the magazine needs to find this pool of new talent as much, because I could just use the same people that worked in 2000 AD. I just want to go back to something about the relationship between 2000 and magazine. I wanted to ask David and Steve, because this is something that I've always thought about. Back in about 1992, there was an interview with Alan Grant in a magazine called Comics World, and he said then that he thought that 2000 AD would end up being merged into the magazine, because at the time it was considered like the stronger title. I just wondered if that was ever considered, or it was just Alan speculating.
That'll be Alan stirring the pot, possibly. He's an agent provocateur and always has been. Certainly in the 11 years I was associated with magazine editorial in one form or another, the magazine almost always sold almost exactly half of what 2000 AD did on any given week or month of the year. So in terms of sales, there was never any prospect of 2000 getting folded into the magazine. It might have gone the other way if the magazine had not been profitable, but that's why we ended up with reprints and all sorts of devices and tricks up our sleeve to keep the magazine on the profitable side of the balance sheet. Certainly when it was being published by Egmont, that was absolutely crucial. If you weren't clearing X thousand, tens of thousands a year, then
there was a sense in sort of like around between sort of like 90, about the early 90s, between up to 1995, that the magazine was considered the stronger title. I mean, it was winning sort of like the National Comic Awards and things like that. There's a sort of sense of feeling that the balance between 2000 and the magazine was the slightly more the place where people were flocking to. There was a sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that was the magazine was at that stage it had the advantage of being, I guess, slightly more nimble on its feet. Because 2000, you need to get material in advance. There was slightly fewer opportunities to break into 2000. I think, in certainly sort of 93, 94, that changed as John and Steve took over as editorial, and they sort of opened out again, and newer people, sort of Henry Flint and Steve White and Dan Abnett joined 2000 while they were running it. And so it started the possibilities of what 2000 AD could do started to open out slightly at that point. Whereas the magazine was seen as, I don't know, you could try out for the magazine. It was possible. And also I was a shameless self-promoter, so I was not afraid of banging the drum and doing my absolute best to get the magazine noticed in any way, shape or form.
Steve, his hand up.
Matt, yeah, I think you're right. I think there was a time, and maybe this is what Alan Grant was referring to, when 2000 AD editorially, in terms of its strips, was not in a great place. Although they had one great thing going for them, which was the Dead Man and that whole Dred saga. And perhaps they rested on their laurels a bit, whereas David, as you said, was out there, really banging the drum and getting new talent on board. He seemed to at Harvey, the whole of Scotland, as far as I could see. It was like a brilliant piece of hiring. But as David also says, after a while, 2000 AD got a second wind, and as David said, some new writers came on board. But the magazine was and remains a very strong proposition. It does what it says on the tin, whereas if you're editing 2000, perhaps you've got a lot of boxes to tick before you can turn around and say, well, this is the bee's knees.
Steve, Alan, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say, as a punter at that time in the early 90s, so I was buying both titles, religiously. Genuinely religiously. It felt very much that 2000 was the slightly more juvenile title still. It still had to, attract a readership. I mean, IPC seemed to imagine that it had half a foot in the sort of 12 to 16 market kind of thing, whereas the magazine was defiantly and absolutely definitely a mature reader's proposition. And because we were the generation, I was 20 when the magazine launched in 1990, and I'd started buying 2000 in 1977, and the magazine felt like the title that was being made for me then, whereas 2000 still had half an eye on getting, quite rightly, current 7-year-olds, even that sort of age. It was a bit schizophrenic, I felt, in 2000 at that point. It didn't quite know whether it wanted to be doing the Horn God all the time, and it was still doing random odd little things like things like Trash and sort of the Harlem Heroes revivals and so on, which felt very, very juvenile. So it was a slightly odd proposition then. Whereas, like I say, the magazine was absolutely, you had to be grown up to read it.
This is what I was going to ask Steve. What was the point of the magazine? What was the purpose and the intention of it?
Just to give the 2000 AD fans of Judge Dredd more of Dred, more of Dred villains, humorous heroes. Give John and Alan more room to develop. It wasn't to my mind, sold as a slightly more adult comic, although it did drift that way. And I think maybe America is a more adult concept. It was such a slam dunk, and there was no need to overanalyze where it was going or what its proposition was. It was Judge Dredd and Britain's #1 comics character. What do you mean he doesn't have his own title? Get on it.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And I think the other thing is, I think Steve's completely right in that America, it sort of shifted how you could tell Dred and the sort of stories that the magazine could tell. And also the new people that were coming on in the first half of the 90s had grown up reading, your Watchmens and your Swamp Things and Dark Knight and other titles that were deemed to be sort of, comics are for grown-ups and all that Eagle Goldkind hype. So the consequence of that was, they wanted to write stories that had a slightly more mature approach. They weren't thinking about writing for 7-year-olds anymore. They were trying to write for readers like them of their age, late teenage into their 20s at that point. So therefore it was definitely a late teenage and above title was the way it became. And I think America was that sort of, paradigm shift to you can do a 2000 AD style story, but you can do it for an older audience. You don't have to try and reach down and satisfy 11-year-olds at the same time. It's a terrible sentence now I think about it.
One thing, I guess this is a question for everybody really. With the intention to expand Dred's world, to allow creators to explore that world, create new characters. Does it work as a concept? You end up with characters like Armitage. You end up with characters like Devlin War. Has the magazine, in its 30 years, achieved its intention? Do you think?
Well, it's still going.
Alan.
Well, I mean, we were just talking about, Rob Williams's, latest strip, the End of Days thing, and that actually bounces all around Dred's world. It's got stuff on Luna One. It's got stuff in Britsit. We hadn't seen, sort of Dred's Antarctic before, but it's there. So it does have the sort of, that whole sort of sense of an expanded world is much more there. Whereas, beforehand, it would be very, very, before the magazine, it would be very, very rare to sort of, illuminate other bits. Or if you saw, a character operating within Dred's world, even a sort of a heroic or anti-heroic character, chances are they end up getting shot by Dred at the end of it anyway. I mean, I always felt John and Alan had a terrible habit of actually killing off, an awful lot of really good characters far too early, when they had, a great deal of potential left to go. So yeah, no, I think it's very much accepted now. The sort of, and it also is very much, it's filtered back into 2000. I don't know how Matt feels about that. But I feel that sort of world is, the Dred world has filtered much more back into the 2000 stories, and now you've had some, quite a few stories like Low Life or so on, which have actually which could potentially have been magazine serials.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, there's often the sort of like a new series will start in 2000 and the readers start to say, well, this feels like it should be in the magazine. So do you keep everything Dred World in the magazine and just have Dred in the prog, or do you allow some of that Dred World stuff to appear in 2000 as well? And I'm happy to have more than one Dred World series running in the prog, because I think there's room for both. But absolutely, I mean the magazine has established this world, and stories in both can pick and choose what they like from it. I remember when the Atlantis story first started, it was about 1985. It was the first time we saw Britsit judges. And there's quite a sort of trumping up of this is where first time we get to see what judges look like on the other side of the Atlantic. So that felt like a big deal back then. But now the magazine has broadened this world. So we can dip into other countries and other judge systems, and quite easily with whenever we like, really.
John, I think you raised your hand to say something a minute ago.
Oh, just in terms of how well the magazine is doing, I read today that apparently the 30th anniversary issue 424 has sold out. Is that right? It's gone back for a second printing.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yep.
Well, that kind of says it all, really.
Yeah. Well, we're very pleased. Let's put it that way.
Well, unless you're printing 7 copies, in which case I rescind my congratulations. But I assume it's still doing a decent print run.
Yeah. One thing I do want to talk about, and David and various people have touched on this, is this issue of the reprints that started in the 1990s and continued for a while. And it wasn't just classic 2000 AD stuff. You also ended up reprinting things like Darky's Mob from Battle, and then there was the controversial period where it was reprints of Preacher and Hellboy and things like that. And I just want to kind of explore, because this was generally when it was thought to be in trouble, that the magazine is struggling a bit. So I just what was the rationale behind that? Were things as dire as an awful lot of people were predicting at the time with the reprints?
Well, it felt like every year we had the phrase "kill or cure" was trotted out as to the way forwards, and it was we sort of had this sinking lid budget policy with Egmont in the back half of the 90s, whereby each year another 10% would get shaved off the budget, and yet you somehow have to manage to disguise this from the readers. And there were ways of doing that in 2000 AD over the years, but it was a lot harder to hide in the magazine. And so bulk reprints basically became, it was either cancel the title or insert bulk reprints, and then it was, what is it that we're going to reprint? And that is probably the one area which I really did not get a good handle on. I didn't have a meaningful philosophy of what the hell we should be reprinting. It was a blessed relief when Andy took charge of the magazine and came in and actually had far better ideas about what we should be running in it, that felt like it should be part of the title, not just like, what we're going to put in this month. So yes, it was a slight panic. I think my favorite thing of all the things I reprinted in the magazine was probably Blackheart by Robbie Morrison and Frank Quitely, which was a wee gem. I do wish they'd do another series of that, but so I was very happy to reprint that. But a lot of it was like, I need something cheap that can fill 20 pages. What you got? And then there we went.
Who was it who first started putting interviews in the magazine? Because that seemed like something that the fans got a lot out of. I mean, to be cynical about it, it's a cheap way of filling a few pages, but it's also, that's the stuff I want to read as a fan. I used to really enjoy these long interviews in Arkansas magazine, where they're just very long, unedited, unspun interviews. And but when did the magazine first start doing those? I'm trying to remember. I have a terrible memory.
Well, I think I was the person who started doing them on a regular basis. Because I mean, the very first thing I did, when I came in, the very first morning that was phone up John Wagner and say hello. And the second thing I did was phone up David Bishop and commission him to write Thrill Power Overload, which is the history of 2000 AD. Because I'd come from this, Doctor Who magazine world, and I felt I understood the fan mentality, and I felt that just reading, the magazine, the deadlines. It was very obvious to me that the reach of the magazine was half of 2000s, but it was also the more anal half, the more obsessive half, the half who actually understood all the obscure continuity references, the half who would not miss it for the world, and yet at the same time slag it off terribly. Doctor Who fans, basically. So I decided to do, the Doctor Who approach, just as I've been doing on Doctor Who magazine. Let's just do the entire history of it. David knows all these people, so he's the natural, and also I was aware that my coming in slightly cheated David out of a job, which I felt really bad about. So that was a fantastic opportunity, and that we ran away with that. They were, David did lots of interviews for that, many of which were massively cut down, obviously, just to get the entire history in. And I started thinking, sort of, as when they sort of came to an end, it was like, well, why don't we just go back and just do more of these longer ones? And that was something that started happening towards the end of my time, and I noticed that you, Michael, you picked up. You did an awful lot after that. I remember reading. We'd not found Jesus Redondo. That was like a real sort of like, wow, we found him. Because we couldn't find a lot of people, could we, when we were doing Throw Up Our Overload? There are a few people who eluded us, like Alan Hebden, who I really wanted to. We felt we didn't need to speak to. We couldn't find him for years. So yeah, definitely no. And I felt that was, and it's you can illustrate it really easily. You just get a load of lovely big panels. You blow them up, and you've got 6 pages, or perhaps even six lots of three lots of 6 pages, and you can run it as a serial. It's great.
I mean, I'm not complaining. That's basically how I ended up in this job. Was thanks to those features. So thanks very much to you for starting them, and thanks very much for Matt for commissioning me for about 6 or 7 years. I mean, it is something that the magazine has. It is an element that has stuck around a lot in the magazine. Matt, there's obviously a cost benefit to having feature content, but you've always struck me as someone who's been keen on having that mix of comics and features as well. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, as Andy said, really, it's something that I'd want to read as a fan. I remember sort of if you're reading like a 2000 Judge Dredd annual, I'd rather read a little feature, behind the scenes thing on how the comics put together, or an interview with a writer and artist, than a bit of reprint that that I just it would the feature would feel more value to me. So I was happy to continue the interviews and features, because I think they had an extra dimension to the magazine, and also with a bigger page count, you got the room to fit these things in that you haven't got with the prog. So I'm happy to continue the features.
Because talking about reprint, obviously now the magazine comes with its own floppy reprint graphic novel. I'm never quite sure whether we've come up with a proper title for those. But
Mini Trade is my thing.
Say again?
Mini Trade.
Mini Trade. There we go. But I have to see people say, "Oh, they should drop this and they can chop X amount off the price of the meg." But I mean, that's not how these things work at all. No. But have you found it? You've experimented with it an awful lot. Have you found it useful as a thing to have, or is it been a millstone?
Well, yeah. I mean, when I took over the magazine, I always felt like the reprint was one thing that was holding it back. That the magazine had this millstone around its neck that was stopping people picking up, because they always knew, oh, it's half a reprint, or it's a third reprint. So I was always conscious of trying to reduce the amount of reprint. And at one point, I reduced the length of the magazine down to 64 pages and cut the reprint down to about 6 pages and reduced the cover price to $2.99. But unfortunately, our retail sales value went through the floor after that, and a distributor said you got to put the price back in. So that's when we came up with the idea of the bag mini trade, of making a value of the reprints by separating it out from the magazine itself, doing it to the dimensions of what the Rebellion trades were, and giving it the same design, and so you were getting this supplement, and it was also continuing Alan launched the Extreme Editions as a venue for reprinting material that was either too esoteric to get a trade collection, or was too short. But when the Extreme Editions wrapped up after 30 issues, I think it was, the magazine supplements carried on that by basically reprinting material that wasn't likely to get a trade collection. So that's been a way of collecting up material that wouldn't necessarily get collected up for one reason or another. It's become more and more difficult to. I'd like to mine a lot more of the archive the stuff that hasn't been reprinted before for the supplements. But with the Treasury of British Comics now under Rebellion's wing, that all the repro work has been done on that. So it means I have to look elsewhere, and you get a lot of complaints about people saying, "Oh, you're reprinting stuff that's too recent." But part of the reason the collection is to read something all under one cover, having it all in a natural, rather than being serialized. You've got the whole story in one go, and that for me is the value of a collection. So you've got the one complete story. So that's what I see the collection's about, rather than how long ago it was originally published.
One thing I've always thought, and particularly back in the 90s, was I always felt that the magazine was the kind of moon to 2000 AD's world, if you see what I mean. It was there as a stabilizer, something that was intrinsic to its existence. As editors, have you felt that the magazine has allowed 2000 AD to survive, has been a contributing factor to its continued existence, or is it just it's another magazine completely? They're two different prospects.
I think 2000 AD would have survived with or without the magazine. I mean, I think it's strong enough, has enough momentum, and has the sort of the legacy element of it that I think it would keep going in good management. I hasten to add, and well edited, of course, because Matt's done an amazing job for light years now. I think one of the things the magazine has contributed is new creators. People that have come on through the magazine and have gone into 2000, certainly in the first half of the 90s, it became sort of like the stepping stone into 2000 for people who couldn't get through the door at 2000 for one reason or another. So I think that made a useful contribution along the years, and it gave people another venue where they could get work published and get commissioned and progress. But 2000 would have survived without the magazine, absolutely. The magazine wouldn't have survived without 2000. So I think it's always been, for a lot of time, it always felt like it was the added extra. If you had more money, you would buy the magazine. If you had the extra disposable income, 2000 was essential. The magazine was a little bit of an added extra, but people would make the effort for us. There was something on the 2000 AD forum recently. They were talking about when people started reading the magazine, I think in the reviews of the 30th anniversary issue. And I was surprised how many people said they started reading the magazine because of either Judgment Day or particularly the Wilderlands crossover in 1994 that forced 2000 AD readers to go and buy the magazine, all those people who didn't want to do it. Wilderlands is not a great crossover, it has to be said. I mean, it's okay, but yeah, it was surprising how many people said they bought it because of Wilderlands and then just stuck with it thereafter. I was going, oh, okay, that worked.
Alan?
I always felt that it was, it's a habit you want to cultivate within readership, like crack. You really want them to develop that extra addiction, and because you do have that that 50% of people who are susceptible. So we were trying to get them to mainline Dred's world, not just to have an add-on. This was the full experience. I always sort of felt. But no, and obviously, no, it was, the 2000 was always the juggernaut. And I was very struck by something John McNeil said to me once, which I was trying to get him to do sort of more and more important stories in the Meg, sort of like with, old character, with sort of PJ Maybe and so on. And he was a little bit vexed because he said to me he felt that 2000 was the paper of record. So that's where the really significant, movements in Dred's world had to be to play fair, really, with the readership. And I did sort of take that on board. I accepted that, although it was, it felt a bit sort of like, can we just kill off some of these big characters and so on, just get people talking? That was always my sort of, I wanted people to be, the message boards were sort of, were still pretty much in their infancy in my time. But I really wanted, every time, the Meg came out, they'd be talking about it. Which is why, I got, for example, Gordon Rennie to write quite an inflammatory column in which he basically be quite rude about his fellow creators quite a lot of the time. And it wasn't a wind up at all. It was genuinely just well, it was a wind up in that sense. But I just wanted people to be talking about the magazine. I felt that was the worst thing would be for the magazine not to be talked about, by the readership. And yeah, I hope that happened.
Yeah, so a wind up for commercial reasons opposed to giving it away for free on social media.
Absolutely.
John.
Yeah, just a couple of things about the difference between writers and artists. I've always found that artists almost infallibly are very, very supportive and very kind of complimentary about each other's work. But in my experience, the same was not always true with writers who would slag each other off mercilessly, like 13-year-old mean girls, And I think Gordon Rennie was an ideal example of the perfect person to write a column like that. But I mean, that was something I noticed. I don't know if anybody else had the same experience, but it was very noticeable. Artists were lovely about each other. Writers weren't.
I like no names. Beyond,
no, I mean the one that, like Alan said, you want to get a reaction out of people. So I used at one stage, I think the letters page in the magazine turned into a sort of a correspondence version of bear baiting. What was the most inflammatory letter I could write to get a reaction? Then all the other readers would rush in. It got to the point, I think the letters page got up to 4 pages, which is amazing cheap content. The only problem was having to retype everybody's letters because, of course, we didn't have email in 1994.
As a reader at the time, I remember reading those letters because there were 2 in particular, wasn't there? There was
Matt Nixon and Slono, yes.
And I hadn't got a clue what they were talking about half the time, but they were very angry about it. So it's very important. I'm conscious that time's ticking on. I want to come back to Steve because as the person who was there at the very beginning, who worked with John and Alan to make this happen, what are your feelings now about the magazine, its highs and its lows, and the fact that it's still going 30 years later?
Well, isn't that great? 30 years. I can't think of any lows, but 30 years is some achievement. So congrats to anyone who ever wrote for it, drew it, or edited it, or PR'd it, or distributed it. Everyone has a part to play, I think. And I suppose that maybe lows would be having arguments with members of management or fellow staffers or staff. But in the end, everyone got through it, and it came out every month. Didn't it, Shako? Yes, it did.
Putting Shako in everything now. It's terrible. Even the podcast. Steve, is there anything you would have done differently at the beginning?
I have no regrets.
This is what happens when you supply the questions in advance.
You got questions in advance?
Hey, copyright infringement. Copyright infringement.
Well, that's a point.
5 seconds, fair use. You'll be fine.
I just really want to round off by asking you each in turn what your feelings are towards your time on the magazine, because from editing for a few issues to editing for a number of years, it's one of those magazines that has sometimes flown under the radar, but it's still with us, and as this month has proven, still has the ability to get people excited. So I wanted to know what your feelings were. We'll go in chronological order, so we'll start with David.
Oh gosh. Well, pride for the fact that it's still going, and it gave a lot of people their start in comics or helped them progress their careers in comics. We published a lot of great material. We published some execrable material. No names, no pack drill. But I look back on the magazine, my time on the magazine, with an awful lot of fondness, because it gave me a doorway into a lot of things I never would have been able to do otherwise. So for me, no, it was a very good experience. There were stresses along the way, but and ups and downs. But no, I'm yeah, I've got an awful lot of affection for the magazine. Always will have.
John.
Well, despite having worked on it for such a short time, I really grew to love it. And I mean, I was leaving to go freelance, but I was in at the beginning of the reprint. I think the first thing that ever reprinted the magazine was Necropolis, which began in either the second or the second to last issue that I edited. And I know that Egmont management at the time seemed to be having a bit of a wobble about the future of the magazine, and it came at the same time as their juvenile title, Lawman of the Future, had been cancelled. So, I mean, I said at the time, there's so much great material in this. There's so much coming up. This magazine has a big future. And, there wasn't a lot of management enthusiasm. I think they never really knew what to do with 2000 AD or its stable of characters. And I think what's saved it is actually something that's always saved 2000 AD. There was... back in the early 90s, the whole, Judge Dredd stable of characters and comics was owned by Maxwell Consumer Publishing, owned by Robert the infamous Robert Maxwell, who then fell off a boat, and we had, the whole 2000 AD package had been bought up almost, within weeks by. Was it Gutenberg? I don't know. Anyway, we were kind of almost like stepping out of a plummeting phone box in a Roadrunner cartoon. 2000 AD survived, and it has always survived, and as has the magazine. So you could say that both 2000 AD and the magazine have had a charmed life, but that is to dismiss the amazing contribution of the writers and artists and editors, and it's entirely, I think, down to the quality that it survived. Also, perhaps because ultimately it was sold to Rebellion, who seemed to know what to do with 2000 AD and Judge Dredd. So it has led a charmed life, and I hope it continues to, because I think it's on a big high. It's looking greater than ever, and there's 169 pages in the 30th anniversary issue. I mean, it's just fantastic. So. The fact that we're all here and talking about it 20 odd years after I worked on it is testament itself, I think. It's a fantastic magazine and long way it continue.
Lovely. Andy, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think my contribution was pretty minor in the overall history of the magazine. I was, John described himself as kind of a caretaker, and I kind of felt that way too, to be honest. But I don't know, the thing for me that really stands out is just the friendships I made. I know that sounds really cheesy and horrible, but just working with creators, with writers and artists, I've got this enormous respect for them, and sort of we've become friends and stayed friends 20 years later, and that's something. And that does sound horribly mawkish, doesn't it? But for me, that's the thing that kind of stands out for me, and also just kind of learning the nuts and bolts of commissioning and storytelling from the inside out. As John was saying, the kind of editing scripts against art, so to make sure everything marries up. But I found that very good training as a writer as much as anything. And also just there's a part of me that was just kind of a big fanboy who was a bit starstruck by getting to work with John Wagner and people like this, and that ain't nothing.
Alan.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Andy said, I mean, one of the big things for me was I had been reader since 1977, and the opportunity to come into an office and sit down and phone up John Wagner and Alan and work with them, and sort of suggest story ideas here and there, because I was quite proactive, and to communicate with people like Carlos. I mean, that's what a fantastic privilege that was. I've got a lovely Carlos cover on my wall. I've got a lovely Cliff Tomlinson did a lovely thing when I left. So that was always the great thing. Actually, that's the thing that particular job gave me, which I didn't get, which I've never had in any. I don't think anyone else really gets. You get amazing artwork coming in your inbox, every other day. And that's the thing I remember so often. You get a package, a beautiful package of stuff from, Colin McNeil or whatever. You open it up, you never knew quite what you're going to get. It was just, that was genuinely thrilling in a way that you don't get with anything else. That excitement of just what am I going to publish? And every now and again, you get a bit of a stinker. It didn't happen very often, but it was. But more often than not, it'd be something from, Henry Flint or Cliff Robinson or Simon Davis or. I mean, Chris Weston, Arthur Ranson, these amazing talents, John Burns, he did fantastic stuff from. And I'll never get that again, So yeah, that's the thing I missed the most. That's the thing I loved the most, and I missed the most. I mean, I did genuinely cultivate a love for the title. I felt, I went in with a very fixed idea of what it should be or what I wanted it to be. And I think I didn't necessarily roll with the punches enough, and perhaps, towards the end I got a bit down because basically I had a budget cut towards the end, which was quite demoralising when it had been a sort of upward curve all the time up until that point. But the magazine always had highs and lows, and I think it always will necessarily. It's a title that dodges bullets on a regular basis. Yeah, I did the 15th anniversary issue. How can it be 30 now? It was just thrilling. It was great. It was brilliant. It was just absolutely brilliant. And I love reading it still. And yeah, I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
And Matt, as the current incumbent of the chair, how did you feel about editing the 30th anniversary issue?
Yeah, well, it's daunting. Well, it's daunting trying to come up with new ways of marking these anniversaries. There's one rolls around seemingly every year. Yeah, I mean, it's a great milestone. It's great to be editing it at this 30 year birthday issue. And yeah, wanted to give it a good issue to mark this occasion, and hopefully it succeeded because yeah, the magazine is is a important comic as much as 2000 AD. It's produced a hell of a lot of really influential stories, created by a lot of influential, very talented writers and artists. So I think I want to make the magazine of an equal to 2000 AD. That it should be the comic you should be picking up every month, as well as your weekly prog. And the stories found within are just as good as what you find in the prog. So that's what I want the magazine to be. It's an equal to 2000 AD.
I'm conscious that I could quite happily keep chatting to you all for at least another hour about all of this and get into the nitty gritty, but I've taken up far too much of your time already. Thank you to you all, and thank you for creating and editing the magazine for all these years.
Yeah, it's good to see you guys.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers, everybody. Take care.
Cheers.
I'm absolutely delighted that we can be joined today by the artist on America, Colin McNeil. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you very much. Hello.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the 2000 AD Thrillcast. Why do you think America is such an important and pivotal story?
I've been struggling with that for about 20 years, actually. Because when I first started on it, when the magazine first came out, I mean, the magazine, from my perspective, from what I was told at the time, was going to be like a 2000 AD for adults, except it was going to be looking at Dred's world specifically. So you'd be able to tell, not necessarily kind of sort of sexual or violent stories. It's not. I'm not in that sense. Not that way adult, but kind of more deep, political, emotional stories, stuff like that. And when I was drawing America, I knew this was something special, but I didn't know in what way it was special. Because this was John Wagner writing the prime Dred story for the magazine, and it was, as far as I know, his first real attempt to do something kind of beyond that which he was able to do for the weekly 2000 AD. I treated it just like any other comic.
Yeah.
any other strip which I'd done previously, I just threw myself into each episode, and I guess over the episodes, just like the way the readers would read it, I got to know the characters a bit more, and gradually found myself, I suppose, falling for them in a way, because everyone kind of falls in love with America, kind of thing, because she's that kind of symbol of that kind of unattainable girl, which everyone has had that experience of. I mean, for me personally, I did see Benny as myself and myself as Benny, and so I could kind of understand his feelings and his emotions as he went through the story, kind of thing. Whereas Dred was just Dred. He was that unchanging constant throughout the whole thing.
I mean, go on.
I was going to say, I don't know why it was so successful. I mean, I knew it was going to be a good story, but I didn't realise just how pivotal it was going to be.
Yeah. I mean, but it's interesting that you mentioned that that Benny Beanie, who for those people who haven't read it yet, is an old friend of America, the titular character. It's interesting that you mentioned that you felt that you were him, because of course the story isn't really about America. It's about Benny and the way that he gets caught between essentially an immovable object, which is Dred, and an unstoppable force, which is America.
Yes. I mean, he is that. I suppose he represents that child inside us all. He is that frightened individual who has no control over his life. He's constantly buffeted by kind of desire and kind of authority and all that, and somehow he manages to come through this story, but he's not the same person. Well, he is the same person, but he's not the same person. But he's not the same person. Once you get to the very last episode, then you realise what that actually means. But,
So let's talk a bit about your artwork, which, you know, at the time when I first read America, blew me away just for the sheer richness of it. Describe a little bit about how you worked back then.
Well, it was fully painted, mixture of ink and acrylic and gouache, coloured pencil, airbrush, bits of photocopies stuck to the page, then painted on top as well. I mean, like all those, well, not all of them, but some of the shots of the Statue of Liberty later on in the story, they are actually black and white photocopies of pictures I found in a children's book in the local library, in the children's section, because that's the only place I could. I mean, this was the days before Google and before kind of the internet and all that. So if you wanted to find a reference to something, you actually had to go to the library. And I did do some of the drawings of the Statue of Liberty, but freehand. But some of them just to save a little bit of time, because I was putting so much effort into each page. I did actually kind of stick this black and white photocopy down on the page in the right bit, and then paint on top of that.
Right.
I know it's a little bit of a cheat, but nowadays people will just kind of grab a screenshot and kind of paste it into their artwork and then do special effects to it, and so it's just the same thing, except it took a heck of a lot of more time. I did really throw myself into America. I was actually living at home at the time with my parents, because I just left art college just a couple of years before. Actually, it was 1989 when I left art college. I'd already been working for 2000 AD for a couple of years up to that point. And I'd done Chopper Song with the Surfer, which was an offshoot of Judge Dredd. And then there was the Death of Johnny Alpha and Strontium Dog. And then America was the next thing I did after that. And that was, there certainly seemed an evolution of my style over those three main series. And I did spend, I don't know, a couple of days per page.
Wow.
And when I say days, I mean I'd start work at 8:30 in the morning, then finish about 11:30 at night.
So pretty intensive work then.
Very, very intensive.
Yeah.
Yes, I pretty much had no social life at all at that point. I was just kind of head down, just falling into the work. Because for me, it's the reason why I became an artist. I suppose at the end of the day, it's drawing was my place to escape. In the same way that kind of reading comics was my place to escape the world around me, kind of thing. Except in drawing, I could actually control that world. So I had a lot of fun. I mean, it was very hard work, especially using kind of the airbrush, because you used to have to use what was it called now? Fisk. This kind of plastic thing you used to have to cut out with a scalpel and all that, and just put on a page and then spray it, let it dry, take it off again, do another bit, cut it again. Photoshop is just wonderful. You can do pictures without getting mucky and without spraying paint across half the room and getting shouted at by your mother for dragging paint across the carpet. And yes, it was very, very labour intensive, but I'm still very proud of what I did on America. I mean, there's things I look back at it and go, I could have drawn that bit better. I could have done that bit better. I could have changed it this way instead of that way. But it's done. It's a moment in my life.
Well,
my artistic life.
Let's talk for a minute about the opening to America, which I think, and I'm sure Douglas would agree with me, is one of the all-time iconic moments in Judge Dredd history.
Oh, the very first page.
Yes, yeah, with Dred standing over, stamping on the American flag. Douglas, as an American, what's your reaction to seeing that?
Marvelous. Absolutely wonderful. I think I've described the story as saying, well, it opens with Dred standing on top of the bullet-riddled corpse of a woman named America, who is an immigrant who is wrapped in the American flag and is standing next to the half-demolished Statue of Liberty, which itself is towered over by an enormous Statue of Justice. It's not subtle. It's amazing.
Yeah, well, 2000 AD has never really done subtle, has it? Let's face it.
Bless it.
But it's interesting that the poster for the second Dred film, over 2 years ago now, was modelled directly on that shot. I mean, Colin, what's it like knowing that they drew inspiration directly off your page?
I never knew that.
Oh, really? All right. There was a version originally done with an American flag on the corner of the building that he stood on, but because of various sensitivities, they decided to just remove that element of it. But yeah, according to everything that we've heard, it drew direct inspiration from the beginning of America.
Well, I must have done something good then, I suppose, if it's if it was considered for a Hollywood movie.
But it's just one of it. I mean, Douglas, you've just done a very good job of describing the scene, and it's everything that is the judges wrapped up in one page. It's the oppression, it's the repression of freedom, it's the dominance of law over freedom itself, and incredibly bravely. And I think there's very few writers who can do this and get away with it, and Wagner is one of them. Can put the end of the story at the beginning.
and for that to be cool.
That's absolutely right. And Colin, I'd love to know how much you knew about the story going into it.
Well, I had the first couple of episodes of the story, so I knew roughly it was going to be about kind of democracy and stuff like that, but I didn't know the twist at the end.
Okay.
Which I won't spoil for anyone if they've never read it. But there are clues to it, which I never really got. There was page 4. America sitting doing her makeup, getting her hair ready before she goes on stage, and in the script it said there's a fine line across America's skull. Across her skin. It's very, very fine. You wouldn't notice it unless you actually look at it.
That is incredible. I'm sat here with the page in front of me. I had never ever that had never registered. That is amazing.
And that was in the script, and I didn't know why. I just knew John said put this in.
Wow.
And it wasn't until the very last episode that we realise what it's all about. So yes, I knew some things about it, but I didn't know other things about it.
Wow. I mean, for anybody listening, immediately go away and read Judge Dredd America, because otherwise we're going to stray into spoiler territory, because there's just too much good stuff to talk about. So yeah, if you're listening, you haven't read it, stop listening, go away and read it, come back and read it. It's just fantastic, and now allows me to ask this question, because you've talked about kind of growing with the characters, and of course over the course of the entire series of stories collected in this gorgeous hardback, you America is only in it briefly, because of course she dies.
Yes.
The rest of the story is then followed on by Benny Beanie, her friend, who has made quite some poor life choices by this point, shall we say.
Yes.
And then of course the story goes on to follow young Beanie, who is the product of the Congress between Benny and America, and her admission into the Academy of Law to become a judge, and that has gone on for many years. I mean, well over 20 years now. This story has been being told, and you've been there pretty much every step of the way, because even in the recent Day of Chaos storyline, when they're towards the end, when they're storming the one of the renegade city blocks, Beanie is there.
Baker.
Yeah.
Yes, she's there. Yeah, she's this little girl from America 2, The Fading of the Light, is now a judge, and she's seems to be one of the major kind of characters of Dred's universe now. It's I
mean, that's an incredible
makes you
thing.
feel quite old, actually.
Yeah, well, that wasn't the intention.
20 years ago, and now they're grown up. They've got a real job and stuff like that, and it's like kind of.
But as there's
a reason my chin's white.
But as an artist, that must be incredible to have been there for all those big moments. You know, to have grown with this character as she has grown up into a fully fledged judge.
Well, yes. I mean, I do feel very lucky to have. Well, first of all, to still be doing this 20 years later. It's really quite amazing, actually. It's yeah. I mean, I don't consider myself one of the greats at all. I'm just a bloke who draws comics.
I can think of a legion of people, myself included, who disagree with you there.
Disagree.
Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
Yes,
you're wrong, Colin. You're wrong.
But you know, it's hard to describe. It's. I mean, I'm just a bloke from the north of Scotland who liked drawing on his jotter at school and getting shouted at by the teacher for doing such things, and managed to kind of get a job, kind of drawing a comic at, drawing a strip at 2000 AD, and here I am, kind of, well, this is 29 years later since I first started drawing for 2000 AD, and it's still a bit of a shock. it's kind of, surely somebody must twig by now. It's kind of, I'm just this kind of little comics fan who kind of liked drawing and kind of fell into comics.
Yeah.
But it's really nice to being part of this great big story, and all these little moments. I mean, like in America too. I mean, there's a bit of a stylistic change of art from America 1 to America 2, but it still has its moments. I mean, it's very much of its time with the digital colouring, because colouring was very new, technology was still very new at that point. But even in that story, there's a few moments where it really is quite hard edged. But people don't really tend to talk about it because it doesn't have the great kind of painted kind of colours of the first one. So I guess that
before we recorded this podcast, I sat and read through the collection, the Mega Collection First Edition, and what does strike me about America 2 is it doesn't necessarily have those big grand moments from the first America story.
No.
But what it does have is a far more complex story. It has, and Douglas may be able to talk some more on this. It's full of mistakes. Everybody is making a mistake, whether it's Benny who has his brain transplanted into America's body, or whether it's the judges, this judge who allows a rather serious sexual assault to take place. It's where everything can really completely falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the ending of the second America story is brilliant and also completely terrifying. Like, is there anything that could have happened to America's dream that is any worse than, having having her daughter become a judge? Like losing the happy little kid who's playing with her lizard at the beginning of the story to her worst nightmare. And then the third story completely turns that around. And I love the look of the third story as well, like the third and fourth stories in the collection, where you've kind of shifted to this amazing kind of pen and ink style that's very, very different from the early stuff, but it's completely gorgeous on its own. It really has this... It has this character to it that looks like it's really, really evolved from the world that we saw in the earlier stories.
No, absolutely, and it's almost as if the strip is evolving, and Colin's style is evolving as the situation and as America grows up.
Well, yes, because it's been 20 years. Said it's been 20 years since the first to America, and I've always tried to evolve my style. Every few years, I've always tried to push myself onwards and see what else I can do with stuff. And it's been, I think, the Cadet and the next story, Judgment Call, you can really see where things have evolved from America too. Because in Cadet, kind of things were a bit more together, not quite there yet. But by the time Judgment Call came along, it was really beginning to feel a bit more grown up in the way that kind of Amy had grown up by this point.
Well, there's those wonderful moments in Cadet, which is the story immediately after America 2, where she is purposefully going out of her way to make Dred uncomfortable. Not not because that's her sole purpose. You know, she's not a bent judge who's just doing it to undermine him. It's just like a little niggle as she gets on with the job. And the biggest achievement she has, certainly in Dred's eyes, is becoming a good judge.
Yes, I mean, it's all about being the best you can be, whether it's being a good judge or just a good person, and trying to find the balance between the two. Because she must be conscious of kind of what her mother was all about, what her father was all about, but also what the judges are all about. And I think she is, I suppose, in some ways, maybe a representation of Dred's conscience, perhaps. She can kind of say the things that Dred really can't. I mean, he could, but it would be kind of somewhat out of character for him.
Well, she's a smattering of empathy, really, within the system. Which
empathy, that's the word.
Yeah,
yes. The reason I'm an artist, not a writer.
But I don't know if Douglas can confirm. It may just be my memory playing up. But I think there is a moment in one of the Beanie stories where she does say, you know, I'm trying to change things from within. It's not about you know, being like my mother and attacking the system. It's trying to be a force for good within it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we see in the fourth one, in Judgment Call, is that Dred has come to respect that. Like, he respects her as a colleague, and he's like, well, I wouldn't do things the way that she does it, but she can do things the way she wants to do it. Like, that's a moment that we've never really seen from Dred before, and it doesn't come off as breaking character at all. It comes off as like, well, this is what the last 20 years worth of stories have led up to. This little moment where we see that he hasn't changed himself, but he's willing to admit that there is a different way of doing things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what's really noticeable about the more exposure he has to Beanie is that, again, as you say, he's not changing, but he's just being more lenient towards the other ways that people want to do things. I mean, we're running out of time a little bit, so I will just kind of round off by saying, rather to my surprise, and I didn't notice this until I had the book in my hand, Matt Smith, the editor of 2000 AD, who's also edited the Mega Collection, has included quite possibly my favourite Colin McNeil one-off story from 2000 AD ever, which is Judge Dredd Firepower, which is a Garth Ennis one-off from the early 90s. Now, I hadn't been a 2000 AD reader for particularly long by this point, so it's just one of the most hysterically wonderful, hyper-violent, Dred walks in the door, sorts the situation out, and walks off stories that I think I've read in a very long time. But go on, sorry, Colin.
No, I was going to say, complete with a cheesy ending as well.
Oh, absolutely,
absolutely. You can make a start in the paperwork. I'll just do the shooting bits, which are fun.
Well, I like the fact that your description of a cheesy ending involves a man with a lawgiver in his chest. Sorry, a lawmaster actually parked in his chest. Is that cheesy?
It is Dred. I mean,
well, that is true.
Dred's got big cheese.
That's almost sentimental for Dred. I'll just leave my bike parked in someone. But it's you know, we've talked a little bit about your style, but that's one of those stories for me that's just so much painted artwork. It can be really stilted, but at the time and still you managed to do this incredibly kinetic thing with color and with movement. It's incredible.
Thank you very much. I was just making marks on the page and having fun. And it's at the end of the day, that's all I've ever really done, is just trying to have fun with the drawing.
Sure.
Well, you also get to do the thing that I think every Dred artist has to wrestle with, which is doing character acting with a character whose eyes you can't see and whose face is mostly covered.
Yes.
Again, how do you go about that? How do you approach that for Dred?
It's a feeling thing. I mean, I've never been I've never done the kind of the look at myself in the mirror, trying to get angles and kind of stuff like that. I've always tried to think of how it feels, a character's emotions or a pose or whatever, and then let that feeling come out through my fingers. And I suppose that's the main way that I get Dred to show emotions, is just subtle kind of subtleties flowing out my fingers, which I don't really have any conscious control per se about, but it's allowing that subconscious kind of feeling to flow through the pencil and the paint or whatever it is.
I think it is a remarkable skill for any Dred artist to imbue him with emotion, but that's just reminding me of there's one moment in Judgment Call when I'm just flicking to it now. Where is it? Oh yeah, the third page of Judgment Call, where Beanie is interrogating Dred, and he kind of questions where her questions are going, and she says, I just thought it ought to be said, never let your perp get too comfortable in the chair. That's how we teach it, isn't it? And he just says, you've got some grit, kid, coming at me like this. Get to the point, my time's limited. And he's biting his bottom lip. And it's like one of those most understated things ever. There's a wonderful Twitter account. It's become a book, Very British Problems. And one of their things was signing off an email with the word thanks to show that you're more angry than you've ever been in your entire life. and Dred biting his bottom lip is him expressing that he's so angry, it's all that, and just to have that kind of tiny little character moment, I think it's fantastic.
Super stuff. Thank you so much to Colin. Over 160 episodes ago. Wow. 2015. Who knew? So thank you very much to him. Thank you very much indeed to Steve and to David and to Andy and to John and to Alan and to Matt for talking about 30 years of the Judge Dredd magazine. Happy birthday, magazine. We'll be back in a week's time with more. As always, Earthlets, make sure you're keeping safe and taking care of one another. Looks like it's going to be a rough autumn and winter. So, all the very best. And we'll see you next time on the 2000 AD Thrillcast Lockdown Tapes. Splundig Verthrig.
Alert! 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 Fill power levels dangerously high. Alert! Alert! Read 2000 AD every week. Ask your comic book store or newsagent now. Subscribe to the galaxy's greatest comic at 2000ADonline.com.